For 326 years, the most dangerous fault in North America has said nothing. It does not rattle, it does not crack the surface, it just sits offshore, underwater, locked tight, quietly winding tighter every single year while millions of people live their lives directly above it. And this morning, for the first time in a long while, the ground near it moved, a magnitude 5.5 off the coast of Oregon, right on the segment scientists fear the most, during a week when the fault's hidden machinery was already running hot. It is almost certainly not the big one, but it landed in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, and tonight I want to show you why that combination is the one that should make you sit up. But first, if you find what we do here at Project Nightwatch worth your time, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next debrief. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The Jolt off Bandon. At 35 minutes past 11 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time on June 29, 2026, the floor of the Pacific Ocean moved about 218 kilometers west of a small town called Bandon on the southern coast of Oregon. The United States Geological Survey put the magnitude at 5.5. They had called it 5.4 at first, in those first raw seconds when only a handful of seismographs had reported in, and then they nudged it upward as the rest of the data arrived. 5.5, a depth of roughly 10 kilometers, an epicenter sitting alone out in the open water, far from any pier or boardwalk or coastal highway, in a part of the sea where almost nobody was there to feel it. And here is the thing you need to understand before we go one sentence further. A magnitude 5.5 earthquake by itself is nothing. The planet makes more than 1,000 of them every single year. They rattle dishes, they wake people up, they make the news for an afternoon, and then they are forgotten by dinner. If this same quake had happened in the middle of the ocean somewhere else, somewhere ordinary, I would not be talking to you about it tonight and you would never have heard a word. So why are we here? Why did this particular tremor, this unremarkable little 5.5, make seismologists from Portland to Vancouver glance up from their screens and hold still for a moment? Because of where it happened. That is the whole story, right there. Not how big it was, where it was. This earthquake detonated at the southern doorstep of the single most dangerous fault in North America. A fault that has been locked, loaded, and utterly silent for 326 years. And the people who study that fault for a living did not panic when they saw the 5.5, but they did not look away from it either. They leaned in, because the ground had just twitched in exactly the place they have spent their entire careers afraid of. That fault has a name. It is called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and we are going to spend a great deal of time with it tonight, because once you understand what it is and what it is capable of, you will never look at a quiet day on the West Coast the same way again. But first, sit with the strangeness of the timing. This was not a busy week for the Pacific Northwest. The headlines that morning were about a heatwave building over the eastern half of the country. The coast itself looked calm, and then, in the dark hours before dawn on the West Coast, the seabed off Oregon let go with a jolt strong enough to be felt more than 600 kilometers away, all the way up in Victoria, British Columbia. The National Weather Service checked and quickly said there was no tsunami threat. A short while later, an automated message about tsunami information drifted through the data feeds, referencing a point southwest of Eugene. We will come back to that message later because it matters, and because getting it exactly right is part of how we do things here. But the headline was simple. The ground moved, hard, in the one place you do not want the ground to move. Now, I want to be honest with you because honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth your time. There is a difference between the fault that will one day end the Pacific Northwest and the patch of seafloor that actually broke this morning. They are not the same thing, and a lot of the coverage you will see tonight is going to blur that line. We are not going to blur it. We are going to draw it carefully because the truth is more unsettling than the exaggeration. The 5.5 was almost certainly not the Great Fault itself slipping. It was something happening on the very plate that feeds that Great Fault. It was the loaded gun twitching in its holster, not the trigger being pulled, and to understand why that distinction should make you more uneasy rather than less, you have to understand what is actually down there in the cold dark under that stretch of ocean. Think for a moment about that little upward revision from 5.4 to 5.5 because it tells you something about how this all works that is easy to miss. In the first moments after an earthquake, the only data available comes from the seismographs closest to the event, and offshore, That means very few of them. As the seismic waves spread outward and reach more and more stations across the continent, the picture sharpens and the early estimate gets refined. Most of the time, the number barely moves. Here it ticked up by a tenth. That is routine science doing exactly what it should. But to a public already primed to be nervous about the West Coast, a magnitude that gets revised upward, even slightly, lands differently. It feels like the situation getting worse in real time, even when it is just the math getting more precise. And that small gap between what the data actually says and how it feels to a worried person is going to come up again and again in this story. Consider too what it means that this quake was felt all the way up in Victoria, British Columbia, more than 600 kilometres from the epicenter. An offshore earthquake at a shallow depth sends its energy efficiently through the crust and along a coastline. That energy can travel a long way before it fades. People that far north would have felt a gentle rolling motion, the kind that makes a hanging lamp sway and makes you wonder for a second whether you imagined it. Nothing dangerous at that distance. But the reach of it, the fact that a moderate quake 200 miles out to sea could be sensed across an international border, is itself a quiet reminder of how connected this whole coastal margin is, how a single event offshore is felt, quite literally, across the entire region that sits above the fault. And here is the part worth holding on to. Everyone who felt that swaying, everyone who saw the headline, experienced it as a discrete event, a thing that happened and then was over. The shaking stopped. The lamp went still. Life went on. But the system that produced it did not stop. The plate did not relax. The strain did not release. The quake was a momentary, visible symptom of a process that is permanent, relentless, and entirely indifferent to the fact that the shaking has ended. That is the gap between what we perceive and what is actually true beneath us, and closing that gap is the whole purpose of tonight. So that is where we are going, down, into the seam where one piece of the planet is being dragged underneath another, where 326 years of silence have been quietly accumulating into something the size of a continent's worst nightmare. The quake off Bandon was a knock on a door. The question is what is standing on the other side of it, and the answer begins with a single simple fact about the geography of the ocean floor that almost nobody on the surface ever thinks about. Part 2. What actually broke. Let me tell you what is happening underneath the water off the coast of Oregon, because it is stranger and more violent than the calm surface ever lets on. Out there, beyond the breakers and the fishing boats, the seafloor is not one solid thing. It is a boundary. It is a place where two enormous slabs of the Earth's outer shell are pressed against each other, and one of them is losing. A relatively small oceanic plate called the Juan de Fuca plate is being slowly, relentlessly shoved eastward, and where it meets the much larger North American plate, it is forced to dive down beneath it, sliding into the hot interior of the planet at an angle. That process, one plate diving under another, is called subduction, and the long curved seam where it happens, running offshore from Northern California up to Canada, is the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Now, where exactly did this morning's earthquake happen? 218 kilometers offshore, 10 kilometers down, and that location, that specific address tells a trained eye a great deal. That far out to sea, and that shallow, the most likely culprit is not the giant subduction interface itself, the place where the two plates are actually locked together. The most likely culprit is the oceanic plate breaking internally, out in the zone of fractured, restless seafloor that geologists call the Blanco Transform and the Gorda region, where the young ocean crust is riddled with smaller faults and is constantly grinding and adjusting as it gets shoved toward the continent. In other words, this was the incoming plate flexing and cracking under the strain of its own journey, not the megathrust letting go. And I can already hear the relief in that sentence, so let me take it away from you. Gently, because you deserve the real picture. It would be easy to say, oh, it was just the oceanic plate, it was not the big fault, nothing to see here. But think about what that actually means. The plate that just cracked off Oregon is the same plate that is being driven under the continent. It is the engine. It is the thing doing the pushing. When the engine groans, you do not relax just because the wheels have not come off yet. The Juan de Fuca plate is under tremendous stress, and that stress is exactly what is slowly, century by century, loading the great locked fault behind it. The twitch and the trigger are connected at the root. They are part of one machine. So when the seabed off Bandon snapped this morning, what it really told us was that the machine is running. The pressure is on. The system that will one day produce the big one is right now, today, actively under load. It is worth lingering on what the Blanco region actually is, because it is a genuinely strange and violent piece of the seafloor that most people never hear about. As the Juan de Fuca plate is borne along an undersea volcanic ridge and then carried eastward toward the continent, it does not travel as one smooth, intact sheet. It is broken into pieces by long fracture zones, transform faults where blocks of ocean crust grind sideways past each other, and the Blanco transform is one of the most active of these. It is, in effect, a busy little fault system out in the open ocean, constantly producing earthquakes of its own as the plate adjusts and tears along its seams on the way to its eventual descent beneath North America. A magnitude 5.5 out there is, by the standards of that zone, an ordinary day at the office. These offshore oceanic quakes happen regularly, and the overwhelming majority of them come and go without any larger meaning. So why then do I keep insisting this one is worth our attention, if it is just the routine grinding of the incoming plate? Because routine is not the same as irrelevant. Every one of these offshore quakes is a small direct expression of the same relentless tectonic push that is loading the great fault behind it. The plate that fractures off Oregon today is the plate being shoved under the continent, and the force fracturing it is the very force that the locked megathrust is storing up. So while a single Blanco region quake does not change the timeline of the big one, it is a visible heartbeat of the machine that will one day produce it. It is the system reminding us, in a small voice, that it is running. And it happened to do so this week in the exact stretch of ocean off the southern Oregon coast that sits above the most worrying segment of the fault, during the exact week that the slow tremor on that segment was running unusually hot. The quake itself is ordinary. Its address and its timing are what make it worth 2 hours of your evening. This is the central thread I want you to hold on to through everything that follows, because we are going to come back to it again and again. The earthquake itself was minor. The fault it sat next to is anything but. And the reason a 5.5 off Oregon is worth 2 hours of your evening is that it is a visible flicker from an invisible giant, a giant that has been holding its breath for 326 years. So what is that giant exactly? How big is the Cascadia Subduction Zone? How much energy can it store? And which cities are sitting in its shadow without ever quite admitting it to themselves? Because here is something most people who live up there do not fully grasp. This is not a California story. This is not the San Andreas, with its dramatic surface cracks and its long Hollywood reputation. The fault we're talking about is offshore. It is quiet. It is almost invisible in daily life, and it is capable of something the San Andreas physically cannot do. The San Andreas is two plates sliding past each other, and that kind of fault has a ceiling on how big it can get. A subduction zone has no such mercy. When two plates are locked face to face and one is diving under the other, the rupture can be longer, the shaking can last not for seconds but for minutes, and the magnitude can climb into the nines. So when I tell you that the patch of plate that broke this morning is the same machine that drives a fault capable of a magnitude 9, I am not reaching for drama. I am describing the architecture of the thing. And to really feel the weight of it, you need to see the whole structure laid out, end to end, from the redwoods of Northern California to the islands of British Columbia. You need to meet the fault properly. Because once you see how long it is, and you realize what sits directly in its path, the silence stops feeling like peace. It starts feeling like a held breath. And the question becomes unavoidable. How long can something that large hold its breath before it finally has to exhale? Part 3. Meet the fault. The Cascadia Subduction Zone runs for about 1,100 kilometers, which is roughly 700 miles, in a long curving line a few dozen miles off the coast. Picture a seam in the ocean floor that begins down near Cape Mendocino in Northern California, where the redwoods come almost to the sea, and runs north past the entire coast of Oregon, past the whole coast of Washington, and up along Vancouver Island in British Columbia before it finally fades out. 700 miles of locked fault. To put that length in perspective, it is like a single crack stretching from San Diego almost to San Francisco, except this crack is underwater, it is largely silent, and it is welded shut under enormous pressure. That word, locked, is the most important word in this entire story, so let me explain exactly what it means. Along most of Cascadia, the two plates are not sliding smoothly past each other. They are stuck. The diving Juan de Fuca plate and the overriding North American plate are jammed together along their contact surface, held in place by friction, while the hidden machinery of the planet keeps pushing them together at a rate of about 3 to 4 centimeters a year. That does not sound like much. It is roughly the speed your fingernails grow. But the plates do not move, even though the push never stops. So what happens to all that motion that should be occurring but is not? It does not vanish. It goes into the rock as strain, as stored elastic energy, the same way a bent steel ruler stores the energy of your hand. Every year the continent's edge is squeezed and lifted and warped a little more. Every year the spring winds a little tighter, and it has been winding, without release, since before the United States existed. When a locked subduction fault like this finally fails, it does not fail politely. The entire stuck section can let go at once, or in a fast cascade, unzipping along hundreds of miles in a matter of minutes. The overriding plate, which has been dragged down and held, suddenly snaps back and up. That sudden vertical motion of the seafloor is what launches a tsunami. The shaking does not last the 8 or 10 seconds of a normal earthquake. It can last 3, 4, 5 minutes of relentless rolling ground motion, and the magnitude, because the rupture area is so immense, can reach into the high 8s or the 9s. The last full rupture of Cascadia is estimated at about magnitude 9.0. That is not a regional disaster. That is one of the largest kinds of earthquake the planet is capable of producing anywhere. And here is what makes the whole thing feel almost unfair. Living up there gives you almost no warning that any of this is true. The San Andreas Fault in California announces itself constantly, with thousands of small quakes, with visible cracks running across the terrain, with a century of cultural memory. Cascadia does the opposite. It hides. It sits offshore and underwater where you cannot see it. It produces very few felt earthquakes on the Megathrust itself, precisely because it is locked, and a locked fault is a quiet fault. So the people of Portland and Seattle and Eugene and Vancouver go about their lives on top of one of Earth's great fault systems, and most days it gives them nothing to worry about. Which is exactly the problem. The silence is not the absence of danger. The silence is the danger accumulating. That is the core of what I want you to feel tonight, and it connects directly back to that little 5.5 off Bandon. The quake we started with was noisy, in a sense. It announced itself. It got felt all the way to Canada. But the truly dangerous thing about Cascadia is the part that makes no noise at all, the locked seam that just keeps loading year after year in perfect silence. The seabed off Oregon flickered this morning. The giant behind it said nothing, the way it has said nothing for more than 3 centuries. It helps to understand just how different a subduction fault is from the kind of fault most people picture when they think earthquake, because the difference is the whole reason Cascadia is in a class of its own. When most people imagine a fault, they imagine the San Andreas, a place where 2 plates slide horizontally past each other, scraping side by side. That motion is real, and it produces large earthquakes, but it has a built-in limit. The plates are only in contact along a relatively narrow vertical seam, so there is only so much surface area to lock up, and only so much energy that can be stored before it lets go. A subduction zone is a different animal entirely. Here the contact is not a narrow vertical scrape, but an immense, gently sloping surface, the broad ramp where one plate slides down beneath the other. That contact surface can be hundreds of miles long and tens of miles wide, an enormous area of locked rock. And the bigger the locked area, the bigger the possible earthquake. This is why every single one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, the magnitude 9s, has happened on a subduction zone. Chile in 1960, Alaska in 1964, Sumatra in 2004, Japan in 2011. Every one of them, a subduction zone letting go. Cascadia is built exactly like those faults. There is also the matter of what sits on top of it, and this is where the human stakes come into focus. The shadow of Cascadia falls across some of the most beautiful and fastest growing country in North America. Portland, Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia, Eugene, Salem, Vancouver and Victoria up in British Columbia. Millions upon millions of people, a huge share of the economic engine of the Pacific Northwest, an enormous concentration of ports and bridges and fuel lines and hospitals and schools, all of it sitting within reach of a fault that the region barely knew existed until a few decades ago. The cities grew up first. The understanding of the danger came second, and came late. Much of the older construction across the region went up during an era when no one in charge of building codes had any idea that a magnitude 9 was part of the local geology. That mismatch between when the cities were built and when we learned what they were built on is one of the quiet tragedies waiting inside this story. And the strangest part of all is how little any of this intrudes on daily life up there. A person can live their entire life in Seattle or Portland, raise children, grow old, and never once feel the great fault offshore because a locked fault gives almost nothing away. The danger is total and the daily evidence of it is almost zero. That is a deeply unnatural situation for the human mind, which learns from experience, from things it can feel and see. There is nothing to feel, there is nothing to see. There is only the knowledge, abstract and easy to push aside, that the quietest neighbour you have ever had is also the most dangerous, which brings us to the obvious haunting question. How do we even know Cascadia can produce a magnitude 9 if no one has ever measured one there? There were no seismographs the last time it ruptured. There were no scientists on the coast with instruments, and yet we know the date of the last great Cascadia earthquake not just to the year, but very nearly to the hour of the night it struck. We know it because of a detective story that stretches across an entire ocean, involving a mysterious wave that hit Japan, a forest of dead trees, and the memories of people who were there. Let me tell you how we crack that case, because it is one of the most remarkable pieces of scientific detective work ever done, and it is the reason we are right to be afraid. Part 4. The Night the Pacific Lied Still. On the night of January 26th in the year 1700, something happened off the coast of the Pacific Northwest that no European had written down, because no Europeans were there to write it. But the Earth wrote it down, and so, in their own way, did the people who lived through it, and so did a meticulous clerk on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. It took scientists nearly 300 years to read all three records and realize they were describing the same event. When they finally did, it rewrote everything we thought we knew about the West Coast. Start with Japan, because that is where the written record lives. In the historical archives of coastal Japanese villages, there are records of a tsunami that arrived in late January of the year 1700. This was a real, damaging wave. It flooded fields, it damaged buildings, it was logged by local officials the way an unusual event would be. But here is the strange part, the part that made it a genuine mystery for centuries. There was no earthquake. Japan is one of the most seismically active places on Earth, and the people there knew an earthquake when they felt one. A large local quake is almost always what precedes a tsunami. But this wave came out of a calm sea, with no shaking beforehand. The Japanese called it, in effect, an orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent earthquake that anyone in Japan had felt. For a long time, nobody knew where it came from. Now cross the ocean to the Pacific Northwest, and look at the trees. Along the coastal estuaries of Washington and Oregon, there are stands of dead western red cedar known as ghost forests. These are the grey, weathered skeletons of trees that once grew on dry land, but now stand with their roots in saltwater marsh. Something killed them suddenly, and that something was the sea. When a great Cascadia earthquake strikes, the coast does not just shake, it drops. The land along the shore can subside by a metre or more in an instant, plunging coastal forests below the high tide line and drowning them in salt water. Those trees died fast, and because trees lay down one growth ring per year, scientists could count the rings and date the death. The outermost rings told them the trees stopped growing after the season of 1699 and before the spring of 1700, winter. The trees died in the winter. And then there is the third record, the human one, and it is in some ways the most moving. Up and down the coast, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest carried oral histories of a terrible night, passed down through generations, of the ground shaking violently and the ocean rising and rushing inland in the dark, of whole villages lost, of canoes thrown into trees. These were not vague legends. They were specific, place-anchored accounts of a catastrophe that struck at night in winter. For generations, outsiders dismissed them as myth. They were not myth. They were eyewitness testimony, preserved across 3 centuries with a fidelity that modern science would eventually have to bow to. Put the 3 records together, and the case closes with a click you can almost hear. The dead trees say a great Cascadia earthquake dropped the coast in the winter of 1700. The oral histories say it struck at night. And the Japanese tsunami records, because they noted the exact date and time the orphan wave arrived, let scientists run the clock backward across the Pacific at the known speed of a tsunami and calculate when the earthquake that launched it must have happened. The answer was the evening of January 26, 1700, at around 9 o'clock at night, local time, on the coast of the Pacific Northwest. A magnitude 9, reconstructed to the hour, from a wave in Japan and a forest of ghosts in the memory of the people who survived it. I want to dwell on the ghost forest for a moment longer, because they are such a perfect example of how the earth keeps records if you know how to read them. A western red cedar is a tree that does not tolerate salt water. It grows on dry coastal land, sometimes for centuries, laying down one ring of growth every year, a faithful diary of good seasons and bad ones written in wood. When the great earthquake dropped the coast and the sea rushed in, those trees were killed almost instantly by the salt water soaking their roots, but the trunks, preserved in the waterlogged mud, did not rot away. They stood, and the wood held its rings. So centuries later, scientists could take a core from one of those grey skeletons, count the rings outward to the very last one the tree ever grew, and match the pattern of thick and thin rings against living trees and other dated wood, a technique called tree ring dating. The match was precise enough to say that those trees stopped growing between the growing season of 1699 and the start of the next one. The forest did not just tell us a great earthquake happened, it told us the year, and the absence of a final partial growth ring told us the season. Winter, a dead forest, standing silent in a marsh for 300 years, holding the date of its own death in its wood, waiting for someone to learn how to ask. The Japanese record sharpened it even further, and the precision is almost eerie. Japanese officials in the year 1700 were diligent record keepers, and the orphan tsunami that struck their coast was documented in several places, with dates and even approximate times of when the water rose. Because a tsunami crosses the open Pacific at a known, predictable speed, roughly the speed of a jetliner, scientists could take the documented arrival times in Japan and calculate backward across the entire width of the ocean to work out when the wave must have been born on the far shore. The math pointed to the evening of January 26th, around 9 o'clock at night, on the coast of the Pacific Northwest. An earthquake with no human instrument to measure it, pinned down to a winter evening 3 centuries ago by reading dead trees on one side of an ocean and flood records on the other, and then, woven through all of it, the human memory. The oral traditions of the coastal peoples, the Quileute, the Makah, the Huayat and others, carried accounts of a night the ground shook and the sea came in and swallowed villages whole, of canoes carried into the tops of trees, of whole communities that were there in the evening and gone by morning. For a long time, the scientific establishment treated these as colourful legend, the way it so often dismissed knowledge that did not arrive in a journal. They were wrong to. The stories were data transmitted across 10 or 12 generations with remarkable fidelity, and when the trees and the tsunami records came in, they confirmed what the people of the coast had been saying all along. There is a lesson in that humility, and it is one this channel takes seriously. Sometimes the record of a catastrophe is written in a language the experts have to learn to respect. That is how we know. And it is why no serious scientist treats Cascadia as a hypothetical. It is not a question of whether the fault can produce a magnitude 9. It already has. We have its fingerprints. The only open question, the question that has hung over the Pacific Northwest for 326 years now, is when it will do it again. And to answer that, scientists had to stop looking at a single event and start reading the much longer record buried in the mud of the ocean floor, a record that goes back not 3 centuries but 10,000 years. What that record says is the reason the word overdue keeps coming up, and it is the next piece of this story. Part 5. 326 years. To understand whether Cascadia is overdue, you cannot look at one earthquake. You have to look at the whole rhythm of them, stretching back across thousands of years, and to do that, scientists had to find a record that the fault keeps of itself. They found it in the most unlikely place imaginable, in the mud at the bottom of the open ocean, in layers of sediment called turbidites. Here is how that record works, and it is beautifully simple once you see it. The continental slope off the Pacific Northwest is steep, and over the centuries fine sediment piles up on it, loose and unstable. When a great earthquake strikes and shakes that whole margin violently for minutes at a time, those piles of sediment let go all at once, sliding down into the ocean basins in immense underwater avalanches. Each avalanche leaves behind a distinct layer of coarse material, a turbidite, sitting on top of the slow, fine mud that accumulates quietly in between. So when scientists drill a core down into the seafloor and pull up a long cylinder of sediment, they are reading a kind of barcode. Layer of quiet mud, then a sudden coarse turbidite from a great quake, then more quiet mud, then another turbidite. Each coarse layer is an earthquake. The mud in between is the centuries of waiting. When researchers read that barcode all the way down, going back roughly 10,000 years, they found something sobering. Cascadia has produced something on the order of 40 major earthquakes over that span, and around 10 of them were the truly enormous full-margin ruptures where the entire 700-mile fault let go at once in a magnitude 9. Do the arithmetic and you get an average spacing between the great full-margin events of something like 500 years, with the smaller but still massive southern ruptures coming more often than that. The intervals are not perfectly regular. Some gaps are shorter, some longer, but the rhythm is unmistakable, and it has been keeping time for 10,000 years. Now place our moment on that timeline. The last full rupture was in 1700. It is now 2026. That is 326 years of silence. We are not past the longest gap the fault has ever taken, but we are squarely inside the window where these things happen, and for the southern portion of the margin, the stretch off southern Oregon and northern California, the very stretch where this morning's earthquake struck, the recurrence intervals are shorter, which means that segment carries a meaningfully higher chance of going first. This is not fringe speculation. The standard, mainstream hazard estimates put the probability of a major Cascadia earthquake in the next 50 years at roughly 15% for a full margin event, and for the southern segment alone, the number commonly cited is closer to 1 in 3. 1 in 3 in the next 50 years for the segment off Oregon. Let me say clearly what overdue does and does not mean, because this is where honesty matters most. Overdue does not mean a clock is about to hit 0. Faults do not run on schedules. The 1700 earthquake did not happen because a timer expired, and the next one will not either. Overdue simply means that we are now inside the range of intervals the fault has used before, that the strain has been accumulating without release for longer than many of its historical gaps, and that the energy stored in that locked seam is more than enough for a magnitude 9. The fault is not promising us anything. It is just loaded. And a loaded fault sitting in the middle of its own historical recurrence window is exactly the kind of thing that makes a minor earthquake in the wrong place feel like a tap on the shoulder. That is why the 5.5 off Bandon resonated the way it did. Not because it changed the odds. It did not. A single moderate quake on the incoming plate does not move the probability of the big one in any measurable way. It resonated because it landed on the southern segment, the segment most likely to rupture next, during a window when the fault is loaded and inside its recurrence range, and it served as a reminder of a truth that the daily calm works hard to make everyone forget. The strain is real. It is there right now, and it is concentrated in a part of the fault that does not advertise itself, that does not produce constant little earthquakes to keep the danger fresh in people's minds. There is a subtlety in the recurrence record that is worth understanding, because it explains why scientists talk about the southern segment with particular concern, the very segment where this morning's quake struck. The turbidite record does not just show that great earthquakes happen, it shows that they do not all happen the same way. Some of them are full-margin ruptures, where the entire 700-mile fault lets go at once in a single magnitude 9. But others are partial ruptures, where only a portion of the fault breaks, most often the southern portion, off southern Oregon and northern California. And those southern ruptures, while still enormous, magnitude 8 events capable of devastating tsunamis, happen more frequently than the full-margin monsters. When you read the southern Oregon record on its own, the average spacing between earthquakes is shorter than the 500-year rhythm of the full-margin events, which means the southern segment, statistically, carries a higher near-term probability than the fault as a whole, and that is precisely the stretch of seafloor where the 5.5 detonated this morning, and precisely where the slow tremor was running hottest this week. It is also worth being honest about the uncertainty baked into all of these numbers, because that honesty is part of respecting you. The turbidite record is good, but it is not a perfectly clean ledger. Reading it requires distinguishing earthquake-triggered underwater landslides from ones caused by storms or by sediment simply piling up too high and slumping on its own. Scientists have developed careful ways to tell them apart by checking whether the same layer shows up in multiple cores spread along the margin at the same time, which points to a single great shake rather than a local slump. but there is still a range of interpretation, and reasonable researchers argue about the exact dates and the exact magnitudes of events thousands of years gone. What they do not argue about is the big picture. The big picture is solid. Cascadia produces great earthquakes on a timescale of a few centuries. It has done so dozens of times, and we are now well within the window. The error bars are on the details, not on the conclusion, and this is the right place to be clear about what the word overdue does to people, because the word itself causes problems. When people hear overdue, they often hear late, as if the earthquake missed an appointment and is now hurrying to catch up, as if each passing year makes the next day more likely than the last. That is not how faults work. A fault does not become more eager to rupture simply because time has passed. The probability of an earthquake on any given day is roughly the same whether the last one was 300 years ago or 326. What changes over time is not the daily odds, but the cumulative likelihood across a span of years, and the simple fact that the strain available to be released keeps growing. So overdue does not mean imminent, it means loaded and inside the historical window and carrying enough stored energy for the worst-case event. Those are different claims, and keeping them straight is the difference between clear thinking and panic. But there is a further down layer to this silence, and it is the part that genuinely unsettles the scientists. Because the fault is not entirely still. Down at its roots, far below the locked zone, something does move, on a schedule of its own, every 14 months or so. It is almost completely silent. You cannot feel it. And every time it happens, it reaches up and gives the locked, brittle, loaded part of the fault a small additional squeeze. In the week surrounding our earthquake, that hidden process was running unusually hot. To understand why that matters, you have to meet the strangest behaviour this fault has, a behaviour we only discovered about 20 years ago, and which may be the closest thing Cascadia has to a ticking sound. Part 6. The hum beneath the silence. For most of the history of seismology, we thought faults did one of two things. Either they were locked and still, storing energy, or they slipped suddenly and made an earthquake, releasing it. Stuck, or snap. That was the whole vocabulary. And then, only about 2 decades ago, instruments sensitive enough to listen to the slow, quiet motions of the Earth picked up something nobody expected. Down at the bottom of the Cascadia Fault, far below the locked zone where the great earthquakes are born, the two plates were doing something in between. They were slipping, but slowly. Not in a sudden violent jolt, but in a creeping, deliberate motion that unfolded over days and weeks, and that gave off a faint, sustained vibration, a kind of seismic hum instead of a sharp crack. Scientists named this behaviour episodic tremor and slip, which is a mouthful, so people often just call it slow slip, or ETS. The tremor part is that faint hum, a tremor signal that does not look like a normal earthquake at all, more like a long whisper than a bang. The slip part is the slow, quiet movement of the lower fault, and the episodic part is the most fascinating thing of all. Under the northern part of Cascadia, these episodes come back on a remarkably regular schedule, roughly every 14 months. Under the southern part, they come more often. They are one of the most rhythmic, predictable behaviours any fault on Earth has ever shown us. The fault has, in effect, a slow pulse. Now, why does a quiet, harmless-sounding slow slip matter? Here is the unsettling part. The slow slip happens just below the locked zone, the part of the fault that is jammed shut and storing the energy for the next magnitude 9. And every time the lower section creeps forward in one of these slow slip episodes, it transfers a little bit of stress upward, onto the locked zone. It is like a crowd slowly pushing forward from the back, pressing harder and harder against the people jammed at the front who cannot move. Each slow slip event nudges the locked, brittle part of the fault a tiny step closer to failure. None of them by themselves is likely to be the trigger, but each one loads the gun a little more. Scientists have come to think of the windows during these slow slip episodes as periods of slightly, and I mean only slightly, elevated probability that the big rupture could begin, because the locked zone is being squeezed a bit harder than usual. And here is what ties this directly to our story tonight. In the week surrounding the earthquake off Oregon, the slow tremor beneath Cascadia was running unusually high. Monitoring picked up something on the order of 3,000 to 3,100 individual tremor epicenters across the subduction zone in a single 7-day window, with one evening alone logging around 535 discrete slow slip events. And the bulk of that activity was concentrated beneath the southern end of the margin and beneath Northern California, with a smaller cluster up beneath the Puget Sound region near Seattle. The southern end. The same segment where the 5.5 struck. The same segment with the higher odds of going first. Now, I have to be careful here, and I am going to be, because the easy version of this story is wrong. The slow slip and the shallow offshore earthquake are two different processes happening at two different depths, and the slow slip is a normal recurring behaviour that happens all the time without any catastrophe following. The fact that tremor was high the same week the quake hit is not proof that anything is about to happen. Slow slip episodes have come and gone hundreds of times since we started watching, and the big one has not followed any of them. So I am not telling you the tremor is a countdown. It is not. Anyone who tells you they can predict the Cascadia earthquake from this week's tremor count is selling you something. It is worth appreciating just how revolutionary the discovery of slow slip was, because it changed the way scientists think about what a fault even is. For most of the 20th century, the model was binary. A fault was either stuck, accumulating strain, or it broke, releasing it in an earthquake. There was nothing in between. Then, in the early 2000s, networks of extremely precise instruments, the kind that can detect the ground moving by mere millimeters, picked up the impossible middle state. The lower parts of the Cascadia fault were moving, measurably, but without producing earthquakes, and at the same time a faint tremor signal was humming up from the same depth. Two different instruments, the position sensors and the seismic sensors, were independently detecting the same hidden event. It was as if the fault had a third gear no one had known about, a way of releasing strain so slowly and so quietly that it had been completely invisible until our instruments got good enough to catch it. And once they knew to look, they found it on subduction zones all around the Pacific, a previously unseen behavior that had been going on beneath everyone's feet the entire time. The rhythm of it is the part that still gives scientists a slight chill, because rhythms in nature usually mean something. Under the northern stretch of Cascadia, the slow slip episodes return with such regularity, roughly every 14 months, that you could nearly mark them on a calendar. That kind of clockwork is rare in geology, and it raises a question nobody can fully answer. If the lower fault has a pulse this regular, and if each pulse loads the locked zone above it a little more, then is there some point in this rhythm when the locked zone is at its most vulnerable? Some researchers have wondered whether the windows during and just after a slow slip episode might be very slightly more likely to host the start of the big rupture, simply because that is when the extra squeeze arrives. The effect, if it is real, is tiny, and it absolutely cannot be used to predict anything. But it is a genuinely unsettling idea that the great earthquake, when it finally comes, might be nudged into being by one of these quiet, regular, almost gentle pulses that have been ticking away harmlessly for as long as we have been watching. And remember where the heaviest pulse was concentrated this particular week. Beneath the southern margin and northern California, with a lesser cluster up under Seattle. The southern margin again, the same segment as the morning's earthquake, the same segment with the shorter recurrence interval, the same segment that the long record flags as the most likely to rupture next. None of these things, the offshore quake, the heavy tremor, the southern concentration, is a cause of the others, but they are all pointing, this week, at the same stretch of the fault. And when several independent indicators all light up over the same patch of a loaded megathrust in the same few days, even the most careful scientist, the one who will tell you firmly that none of it predicts anything, will admit that it makes the hair on the back of the neck stand up. But here is the honest, uncomfortable middle ground, the place where the truth actually lives. Every one of those slow slip episodes does load the locked zone a little more. The strain is real and it is cumulative. So while no single episode is a countdown, all of them together are the slow, patient process by which the silence becomes a magnitude 9. The hum is the sound of the gun being loaded, and the question that keeps seismologists up at night is the one they cannot answer. Which slow slip episode, which quiet 14-month pulse, will be the one that finally nudges the locked zone past the point of no return? It could be 150 years from now. It could be the one happening right now, this week, under southern Oregon. And if it is, the question becomes the most important one of all. What, exactly, does it look like when this fault finally exhales? What happens to the Pacific Northwest in the first 5 minutes? Because the answer is not a story about cracked roads. It is a story about a region coming apart all at once. Part 7. The first 5 minutes. Let me walk you through what the science says a full Cascadia rupture would actually do, not to frighten you for the sake of it, but because the scale of it is the only thing that explains why a minor quake in the right place gets this kind of attention. When the locked zone finally fails, the rupture can tear along hundreds of miles of fault in a matter of minutes. And the first thing that happens, the thing that defines everything after it, is the shaking. Not the 8 or 10 seconds you might expect from an ordinary earthquake. We are talking about 3, 4, possibly 5 minutes of violent rolling ground motion, sustained, relentless, long enough that people who have lived through smaller quakes describe the experience as a kind of disbelief, a sense that it simply will not stop. 5 minutes does not sound long when you read it on a page. Stand up and imagine your house moving hard for 5 full minutes. Imagine every shelf emptying, every unsecured object becoming a projectile, every old brick chimney and unreinforced wall failing, every bridge and overpass enduring shaking far longer than most were ever designed to survive. Modern engineering can handle a sharp jolt. Sustained shaking for minutes is a different kind of test, and a great deal of the older infrastructure across the Pacific Northwest was built before anyone fully understood that this was the threat they faced. For decades, the region did not even know Cascadia could do this. The buildings went up anyway. Then comes the drop. Remember the ghost forests, the trees that died because the coast suddenly subsided into the sea? That same coseismic subsidence would happen again, instantly, all along the coast. Stretches of shoreline could drop by a meter or more in moments, permanently lowering the land and changing the map. And that drop is the opening act of the second disaster, because the same sudden snap of the seafloor that drops the coast also launches the wave. The tsunami from a full Cascadia rupture would not be a distant threat with hours of warning, the way a tsunami from across the ocean might be. For the outer coast of the Pacific Northwest, the wave would arrive in minutes, in some places 15 or 20 minutes, in some places less. There would be no time to wait for an official alert and then decide what to do. The shaking itself would be the warning, and the only correct response would be to already be moving uphill before the ground even stops. Communities along that coast have begun to understand this. They have built vertical evacuation structures, they have marked tsunami routes, they have run drills. But the geography is unforgiving. Many coastal towns sit on low ground with high terrain too far away to reach in the time available. And then there is the cascade that follows, the slower disaster that unfolds over hours and days. The Pacific Northwest concentrates an enormous amount of critical infrastructure in vulnerable, low-lying, often liquefiable ground. Fuel supplies, port facilities, pipelines, and storage tanks, much of it built on soils that can turn to something like quicksand when shaken, a process called liquefaction. A great deal of the region's fuel moves through a small number of facilities along the riverfronts, many of them old, many of them sitting on exactly the kind of ground that fails under prolonged shaking. The realistic projections describe ruptured tanks, spilled fuel, fires, and a region cut off from the very supplies it would need to respond, with bridges down, roads buckled, and the coast isolated. The death toll estimates run into the thousands. The recovery is measured not in weeks but in years. There is one more dimension to the Cascadia scenario that rarely gets discussed and deserves a sentence, and it is the matter of the rivers and the long-term reshaping of the land. When the coast drops by a meter or more in the instant of the rupture, that change does not undo itself when the shaking stops. It is permanent or close to it. Land that sat safely above the tides is suddenly lower, and places that flooded only in the worst storms can become regularly inundated. Estuaries shift. Riverfronts that had been dry for generations find themselves in a new relationship with the sea. The earthquake, in other words, does not just break things in a violent few minutes. It redraws the map, and the new map is the one the survivors have to live on afterward, with a coastline that has been permanently lowered and a whole zone of newly vulnerable ground. The recovery is not just rebuilding what fell, it is adapting to a terrain that has physically changed shape. I want to be measured about this because doom for its own sake is not what we do here. None of this is a prediction that it will happen tomorrow. It is a description of a known scenario, a scenario built on the 1700 earthquake we already proved happened, on the 10,000-year record we already read in the mud, on the engineering studies that already exist. It is not a question of if. The fault will rupture again. It is only a question of when and of how ready the region chooses to be when it does. Let me make the liquefaction piece concrete, because it is one of those concepts that sounds abstract until you understand what it actually does to the ground under a city. Much of the developed low-lying land around the rivers and bays of the Pacific Northwest is built on soft, water-saturated sediment, the kind of loose, wet soil that fills in river valleys and old tidal flats. Under normal conditions, that soil behaves like solid ground. You can build on it, drive on it, never think about it. But when it is shaken hard for minutes at a time, the grains of soil lose their grip on each other, the water trapped between them takes over, and the whole mass briefly behaves like a liquid. Solid ground turns for a few terrible minutes into something with the consistency of wet sand at the water's edge. Buildings tilt and sink, underground pipes float upward and rupture, roads and runways crack apart, and critically, the very ground beneath the region's fuel storage, its ports, and its bridges is in many places exactly this kind of liquefiable soil. The shaking does not even have to topple a structure directly. It can simply dissolve the ground out from under it. Now layer the timeline of the cascade on top of that. In the first 5 minutes, the shaking and the liquefaction. Within the first 10 to 30 minutes, the tsunami reaching the outer coast. In the first hours, the fires, as ruptured gas lines and spilled fuel ignite with no functioning system to fight them, much the way the 1906 San Francisco disaster killed more people through fire than through shaking. In the first days, the dawning reality of isolation, as the region discovers that the bridges it relied on are down, that the highways have buckled, that the fuel it needs to run its generators and trucks is the very fuel that spilled and burned, and that the supplies have to come from outside a region that is now extremely hard to reach. The experts who model this describe a recovery measured not in the weeks we associate with a hurricane, but in months and years. Some of the projections suggest parts of the coast could be without reliable services for a very long time indeed. I keep returning to the human scale of it because the numbers can go numb. Thousands of projected deaths is a statistic, but every one of those is a person who woke up that morning to an ordinary day, who had no reason to think this Tuesday or this Thursday was different from any other. That is the cruelty of an event with no warning. It does not select for the unprepared or the unlucky in any way they could have seen coming. It simply arrives in the middle of a normal morning and divides time into before and after, which is exactly why the only mercy available is the mercy we build in advance, in the quiet years, when the fault is still silent and there is still time to choose, and now hold all of that next to the thing we started with, a magnitude 5.5 off Bandon, by itself, nothing. But it landed on the southern doorstep of the fault that does all of this, during a week of elevated slow tremor on that same segment, inside the recurrence window, on a fault loaded with 326 years of strain. That is why the scientists leaned in. Not because the 5.5 was the big one, because it was a flicker of motion from the system that will one day produce it. But here is where the story takes a turn that surprised even me as I dug into it. Because that same morning, while Oregon shook, the rest of the Pacific Rim was not quiet either. Far to the north, off Alaska, the ground moved too, and across the ocean, off the Philippines, something even stranger was happening. The Oregon quake was not an isolated event on a calm planet. It was one note in a chord that was sounding all the way around the Pacific. And the question of whether that chord means anything, whether these scattered shocks are connected or merely coincident, is where this story stops being about one fault and becomes about the restless architecture of the entire world. Part 8. The Same Night. Around the Rim. Let me take you on a quick trip around the Pacific Ocean, around the great loop of fault lines and volcanoes that we call the Ring of Fire, and show you what else was happening in the same window of time as our Oregon earthquake. Because once you see it laid out, you will understand both why people start connecting dots, and why connecting those dots requires a very careful hand. Start by going north from Oregon, up the coast, all the way to Alaska, in the same window, near the town of Cordova, on the southern Alaskan coast, a magnitude 5.3 earthquake struck at a shallow depth. Now, that location is not random trivia. That stretch of southern Alaska is another locked subduction margin where the Pacific Plate dives under North America, and it is the exact region that produced the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake, a magnitude 9.2, the second largest earthquake ever recorded by instruments anywhere on Earth. That 1964 quake devastated Anchorage, reshaped the coastline, and sent a tsunami down the west coast that killed people as far away as Northern California. So when a 5.3 rattles that same margin, it is, like the Oregon quake, a small event on a giant system, another corner of the loaded rim flexing. Keep going, Across the ocean, off the coast of Japan, earthquakes far below the surface in the Volcano Islands region. Down through Indonesia, a string of moderate quakes in the Molucca Sea near Sangihe, south of Lombok, the everyday seismic pulse of one of the most active subduction regions on the planet. In China, a magnitude 5.2 in eastern Sichuan. In the Kermadec Islands near New Zealand, a magnitude 4.9. And in the Philippines, which we are going to come back to in detail, an active swarm of earthquakes off the coast of Luzon. Add to that the lingering aftershocks of recent disasters, the sequence still rattling Mindanao in the southern Philippines, where a magnitude 7.8 had struck not long before, and the aftershocks still shaking Venezuela after its recent catastrophe. In total, across the whole planet, the count of earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater in the previous 7 days stood at 108. The 1964 Alaska earthquake deserves a moment of its own, because it is the closest analogue we have on this continent to what Cascadia will one day do, and it is no longer just a number in a record book, it is living memory. On Good Friday of that year, the fault beneath southern Alaska ruptured in a magnitude 9.2 that shook for nearly 5 minutes. Whole neighbourhoods of Anchorage slid downhill on liquefied ground. The coastline itself was permanently rewritten, with some areas lifted by several metres and others dropped, harbours left high and dry or drowned. And the tsunami it generated raced down the entire west coast of North America, killing people in Oregon and as far south as Crescent City, in Northern California, which was struck by waves that destroyed much of its waterfront. That was a Cascadia-sized event, on a Cascadia-style fault, and it happened within the lifetime of people still alive today. When a magnitude 5.3 rattles that same Alaskan margin now, as it did during our window, it is the same kind of small flicker from a giant system that the Oregon quake was. Another corner of the loaded northern rim shifting its weight, and that is really the thread that ties this whole tour together. From the Aleutians of Alaska, down the coast of British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, along California, down through Mexico and Central and South America, and then across the bottom of the Pacific and back up through New Zealand, the Philippines, Japan and the Kuril Islands, runs one continuous loop of plate boundaries, the Ring of Fire. It is not a metaphor and it is not loose talk. It is a real, physical, connected ribbon of subduction zones and faults, the seam where the Pacific Plate and its neighbours meet the surrounding continents, and it is responsible for the overwhelming majority of the world's great earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Every place we just visited tonight, Oregon, Alaska, Sichuan, Indonesia, the Kermadecs, the Philippines, sits somewhere along that loop. So when several of them stir on the same night, it is not because they are signalling each other. It is because they are all parts of the same enormous structure, all under the same kind of relentless strain, all capable of moving at any time. 108. Now, the human brain sees a number like that, sees Oregon and Alaska and the Philippines all shaking on the same night, and it does what human brains are built to do. It looks for the connection. It wants there to be a single cause, a master switch, a reason all of these things are happening at once. And I understand that impulse completely. It is not foolish. It is the same pattern-finding instinct that makes us good at survival. But I owe you the truth, and the truth requires me to slow down right here and ask a hard question. Are these earthquakes actually connected? Did Oregon and Alaska and the Philippines somehow trigger one another? Or are we looking at coincidence? At the simple fact that a planet this seismically busy will always have several things happening at once if you look at any given night? The honest answer is mostly the second thing, with one fascinating exception that we need to talk about, because real physics does allow distant earthquakes to influence each other in specific limited ways. And understanding exactly where the connection is real, and where it is just our pattern-seeking minds drawing lines between unrelated dots, is the difference between understanding the planet and being misled by it. So let me show you what genuine connection between distant quakes looks like, what it does not look like, and why the most dangerous place on this entire map tonight is not Oregon at all. It is a trench off the coast of the Philippines that you have probably never heard of, and that is capable of something almost beyond imagining. Part 9. The Other Loaded Gun. Off the western coast of the island of Luzon, the most populous island in the Philippines, the home of the capital city of Manila and tens of millions of people, there runs a feature in the seafloor called the Manila Trench. And in the same window of time that Oregon shook, the Manila Trench was doing something that made the people who watch it sit up straight. It was swarming. A cluster of earthquakes, a magnitude 5.0 and several events in the magnitude 4 range, was rattling the trench near 16.5 degrees north latitude, right on the line of the trench itself. And here is the detail that matters most. There was no main shock. There was no single large earthquake that these others could be explained as aftershocks of. They were just a swarm, a cluster of shocks with no obvious parent, all happening right on top of a fault system that almost nobody outside of seismology has ever heard of. So let me tell you why the Manila Trench deserves your attention, because the numbers are genuinely staggering. The Manila Trench is a subduction zone, like Cascadia, where one plate is diving beneath another. But its convergence rate, the speed at which the plates are being pushed together, is extraordinarily high, cited in the research at around 100 millimeters a year. Remember that Cascadia closes at about 3 to 4 centimeters a year. The Manila Trench is being squeezed at roughly 100 millimeters, which is 10 centimeters, a year, 2 to 3 times faster. That means it accumulates strain faster. The spring winds tighter, quicker, and the trench has gone a very long time without a great strain-releasing earthquake, which means the energy has been piling up, fast, for a long time, with no major release. How much energy could it hold? Multiple peer-reviewed studies, and I want to stress that this is not my guess or anyone's hunch, but the published conclusion of serious research estimate that the maximum credible earthquake on the Manila Trench is around magnitude 9.2, the same size as the Great Alaska Earthquake, as large as the largest events Cascadia can produce, and the consequence that follows from that is the part that should make your stomach drop. The modelling of a Great Manila Trench earthquake projects tsunamis that could reach run-up heights of nearly 15 metres, around 48 feet, on the northern Philippine coast. And because the trench sits so close to that coastline, the arrival time for the nearest, most densely populated shores, the coast around Manila Bay, could be as short as 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Sit with that. With Cascadia, the outer coast might get 15 or 20 minutes between the shaking and the wave, and even that is brutally short. On the Manila Trench, for the nearest coast, the wave could be ashore in about the time it takes to read this paragraph aloud. There is no official warning system on Earth fast enough to help in 2 minutes. The shaking would be the only warning, and for a coastline of that size and that population density, 2 minutes is very close to no warning at all. This is one of the great under-discussed catastrophic hazards on the planet, a fault capable of a magnitude 9.2, loaded by one of the fastest convergence rates anywhere, sitting 2 minutes of tsunami travel time from one of the most crowded coastlines in the world. And right now, today, it is swarming. Now, does a swarm mean a great earthquake is coming? I have to be honest, and the honest answer is, almost certainly not, but we cannot be sure, and that uncertainty is exactly why it is watched so closely. Most earthquake swarms are just swarms. They rattle for a while and then they fade and nothing larger follows. The base rate, the background probability that any given swarm is actually a foreshock sequence preceding a big quake, is low, on the order of a few percent to maybe 10% depending on how you count. So the overwhelmingly likely outcome of this particular swarm is that it quiets down and the trench goes back to its long, dangerous silence. But here is the catch, the reason careful people watch anyway. A swarm with no main shock sitting on a fault that is known to be loaded and capable of a magnitude 9.2 is precisely the configuration that, in the rare cases when something big does follow, looks exactly like this beforehand. The probability is low, the stakes are unimaginably high, and that combination, low odds times catastrophic consequences, is the definition of a risk you do not ignore. There is a cruel geographic irony in the Manila Trench that makes it almost the worst-case version of the Cascadia problem. With Cascadia, the fault sits well offshore, and while that means a tsunami can still arrive frighteningly fast, it also means the largest population centres, Portland and Seattle, are inland enough that the wave is not their primary threat, the shaking is. The Manila Trench does not offer even that small grace. It runs close to the coast, and that coast is one of the most densely populated stretches of shoreline on the entire planet, with Manila and its surrounding region holding well over 10 million people, much of it on low ground at the water's edge. So you have the fastest possible arrival time meeting the highest possible exposure. A wall of water potentially close to 15 metres high, arriving in as little as 2 minutes on a coast crowded with millions. It is, on paper, one of the most dangerous single tsunami scenarios anywhere in the world, and it is strange how little attention it gets compared to the faults that menace wealthier coastlines. And the reason it has gone relatively quiet for so long is itself part of the danger, in the same way Cascadia's silence is part of its danger. A fault that ruptures often, releasing its strain in frequent moderate earthquakes, never gets the chance to store up the energy for a true monster. It is the quiet faults, the ones that lock up and say nothing for centuries while the plates keep pushing, that accumulate the strain for the largest events. The Manila Trench, closing at that extraordinary rate of around 100 millimeters a year and not having released a great earthquake in a very long time, fits the profile of a fault quietly winding towards something large. The swarm happening on it right now does not tell us that the something large is near, but it is a reminder that the trench is not dead. It is loaded and alive, and it is sitting 2 minutes from one of the great cities of the world. I also want to connect this back to a place we have visited before on this channel, because the Philippines has been restless across this whole region for a while now. The southern Philippines around Mindanao was struck by a major magnitude 7.8 not long ago, and its aftershocks were still rattling through during this very window. So the picture around the Philippine Islands is of a whole archipelago under stress, multiple trench and fault systems all active at once, the south still settling from a recent great quake, while the north, on the Manila Trench, begins to swarm. It is the same lesson Cascadia teaches, written in a different ocean. These subduction systems are immense, they are loaded, and they express themselves in many places at once, on their own schedules, indifferent to the cities that have grown up in their shadow. So now we have 2 loaded guns in the same story. Cascadia, off Oregon, silent for 326 years, flickering this morning with a 5.5 and a week of heavy tremor, and the Manila Trench, off Luzon, winding tighter than almost any fault on Earth, swarming right now with no main shock to explain it. 2 subduction zones, 2 magnitude 9 potentials, 2 coastlines waiting, and both of them stirring in the same window of time. And that brings us straight back to the question we have been circling. Is that a coincidence, or is there some thread, some real physical connection running between these distant, restless faults? The answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no, and getting it right is the difference between understanding the planet and being fooled by it. Part 10. One Restless Planet. So let us settle this honestly. Are the earthquakes around the Pacific Rim connected to each other? When Oregon shakes and Alaska shakes and the Manila Trench swarms in the same window, is one causing the others? The answer has 2 parts, and you need both, because the truth lives precisely in the space between them. Here is the first part, the part that says no. The immense majority of the time, earthquakes happening thousands of miles apart have absolutely nothing to do with one another. They are not connected. They cannot be connected because the stresses that drive a fault to rupture are local. They come from the specific plates grinding against each other in that specific place, and the influence of a distant earthquake, once you get far enough away, fades to essentially nothing. The reason it looks like everything is happening at once is a trick of statistics and attention. The planet is enormously active. There are dozens of earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater somewhere on Earth every single week. So on any given night, if you draw a map of the whole Pacific Rim and you look hard, you will always find several things happening at the same time. That is not a pattern. That is just what a busy planet looks like when you watch all of it at once. We notice the simultaneity, and our minds insist it must mean something, but most of the time it means nothing more than that the Earth is, as always, busy. Now here is the second part, the part that says, well, sometimes a little. Because real physics does allow distant earthquakes to influence each other, in 2 specific and well-documented ways. The first is aftershocks, which are local, the swarm of smaller quakes that follows a large one in the same region, as the crust around the rupture readjusts. Those are real connections, but they are confined to the neighbourhood of the original quake. The second, and the genuinely fascinating one, is called dynamic triggering. When a truly great earthquake occurs, the seismic waves it sends out travel around the entire planet. And as those waves pass through a distant fault that is already loaded, already sitting right at the very edge of failure, the passing wave can sometimes be the final nudge that tips it over. It is real. It has been documented. But, and this is the crucial point, it only works on faults that are already on the absolute brink, and it requires a very large earthquake to send out waves strong enough to do it. A moderate 5.5 off Oregon does not send out waves powerful enough to trigger anything across an ocean. So dynamic triggering is real, but it is the exception, not the rule, and it does not explain a night of scattered moderate quakes. So when you put the two parts together, you get the honest synthesis, and it is more compelling than the false version where everything is secretly connected. The earthquakes off Oregon and Alaska and the Philippines are not coordinating with each other. There is no master switch. But they are all expressions of the same single, immense, restless system, the network of plate boundaries that wraps around the Pacific Ocean, and is, everywhere along its length, under continuous and accumulating strain. They are not one event. They are many events in many places, all driven by the same relentless engine of plate tectonics. The Ring of Fire is not coordinating. It is just, all of it, all the time, loaded. And that, in a strange way, is more sobering than a conspiracy of connected quakes would be. Because a master switch could, in principle, be turned off. A single cause could be addressed. But what we actually have is worse. We have a planet whose entire Pacific Rim is under strain everywhere at once, with multiple magnitude 9 capable faults all sitting in their loaded windows simultaneously, none of them needing the others, each one perfectly capable of going on its own schedule for its own local reasons. Oregon does not need Manila to fail. Manila does not need Oregon. They are independent loaded guns, and we are surrounded by them. Let me give dynamic triggering its due, though, because it is genuinely one of the more astonishing things we have learned about how the planet works, and it is the kernel of truth that the everything-is-connected crowd is reaching for. When a truly great earthquake ruptures, a magnitude 8 or 9, it does not just shake its own neighborhood. It sends seismic waves rolling outward through and around the entire Earth, waves that can circle the globe several times before they fade. And we have documented cases where, as those waves swept through a distant region thousands of miles away, there was a measurable little uptick in small earthquakes there, right as the waves passed. The Great Sumatra earthquake of 2004, the enormous Chile and Alaska events, the 2012 quakes in the Indian Ocean, all of them have been linked to tiny bursts of seismic activity at faraway faults as their waves rolled through. So the planet is, in a limited and real sense, occasionally connected across immense distances. A big enough shock truly can reach out and tickle a fault on the other side of the world. But, and this is the part that matters for tonight, dynamic triggering has strict rules. It only works on faults that are already at the absolute knife edge of failure, so close that a passing wave can be the last tiny straw. It mostly produces small earthquakes, not great ones, and crucially it requires a very large earthquake to do the triggering in the first place, because you need waves strong enough to still matter after travelling thousands of miles. A moderate magnitude 5.5 off Oregon simply does not have that kind of reach. Its waves fade to nothing long before they could nudge a fault in the Philippines. So whatever was happening on the Manila Trench this week, the Oregon quake did not cause it, and the Manila swarm did not cause Oregon. There was no great earthquake in this window powerful enough to be triggering anything across the globe. What we had instead was a scattering of independent moderate events, each one local, each one driven by its own patch of straining plate boundary. So hold both truths at once, because that is the mark of actually understanding this rather than being fooled by it. Yes, the planet can occasionally connect distant earthquakes through the real physics of dynamic triggering. And no, that is not what happened this week, because none of these quakes was large enough to reach across oceans, and the simultaneity we witnessed was the ordinary statistics of a very busy planet. Both things are true. The connection is real but rare, and this particular night was not one of the rare cases. It was just the Ring of Fire being the Ring of Fire, loaded everywhere, flexing in several places at once, signifying nothing more and nothing less than a world under permanent strain. Which is exactly why, when people see a night like this one, so many of them reach for a single explanation, a cause that ties it all together, and lately the single explanation they reach for most often is not down in the Earth at all. It is 93 million miles away, on the surface of the Sun. There was, in fact, an enormous and complex sunspot facing the Earth during all of this, and a very popular theory says it was responsible for the whole restless night. It is a compelling idea. It is also wrong, and exactly why it is wrong tells you something important about how the universe actually works. So let us go up to the Sun and deal with it directly. Part 11. Did the Sun do it? During this whole restless stretch around the Pacific, the Sun was, in fact, putting on a show. There was a large, magnetically complicated sunspot region facing the Earth, catalogued by space weather forecasters with the designation 4478, a region with the kind of twisted, tangled magnetic structure that scientists describe with the label beta-gamma delta, which is shorthand for a sunspot complex enough to be capable of producing powerful flares. Its flare probabilities were elevated. There was talk of the possibility of an X-class flare, the strongest category. So the timing was, on the surface, almost too perfect. A giant, angry sunspot staring straight at Earth, and the planet's faults rattling all at once. The idea writes itself. The sun is shaking the Earth. This is one of the most popular and persistent ideas in the whole world of online earthquake discussion. The notion that solar activity, sunspots, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, geomagnetic storms, somehow triggers earthquakes down here on the ground. And I want to treat it with respect, because the people who believe it are not stupid, and the instinct behind it is a good one. They are noticing two genuinely powerful, genuinely active systems at the same time, the busy sun and the busy Earth, and they are connecting them. That is exactly what a curious mind is supposed to do. The problem is not the curiosity. The problem is that when you actually run the numbers, the connection falls apart completely, and it falls apart for a reason that is worth understanding. The issue is energy, and specifically the staggering mismatch in the amounts of energy involved. Think about what it takes to trigger a great earthquake. You have two continental-scale slabs of rock, locked together under immense pressure, held by friction across a fault hundreds of miles long. The amount of force required to overcome that friction and make them slip is almost beyond comprehension. Now think about what a solar storm actually delivers to the solid Earth. A geomagnetic storm, even a strong one, mostly interacts with our planet's magnetic field and upper atmosphere. It can light up the auroras, it can disturb radio signals, it can induce currents in power lines. But the actual mechanical energy it transmits down into the solid rock of the crust, the energy that could push on a fault, is smaller than the stress changes the Earth experiences from something as ordinary as the tides, the daily pull of the moon flexing the planet. And the tides do not trigger great earthquakes either. The solar storm's nudge on a fault is not just small, it is thousands upon thousands of times too small to overcome the friction locking a megathrust. The numbers are not close, they are not even in the same universe, and it is not just a theoretical argument. Scientists have actually gone and checked, repeatedly, with large statistical studies, comparing decades of solar activity against decades of global earthquakes, looking for any reliable correlation. And the answer that keeps coming back is that there is no robust, dependable connection. Earthquakes do not preferentially happen during solar maximum. They do not cluster reliably after big flares. The global earthquake rate marches to the beat of plate tectonics, not the beat of the sun. But here is the detail from this very night that should settle it for you completely, because it is almost poetically perfect. During this whole stretch, while the sun looked busy and that big sunspot stared down at us, the Earth's geomagnetic field was actually quiet. The geomagnetic activity, measured by an index called the KP index, was low. In other words, the sun was not even successfully storming the Earth in this window. The flares had not produced a major geomagnetic disturbance here, and the earthquakes happened anyway. Oregon shook, Alaska shook, the Manila Trench swarmed, all during a quiet geomagnetic period. That is the exact opposite of what the solar trigger theory predicts. If the sun were driving the quakes, you would expect the shaking to follow the storming. Instead, the Earth shook while the sky stayed calm. The theory does not just lack a mechanism, it is contradicted by the very night people are using to support it. So no, the sun did not do it. The sunspot was real, the flares were real, the auroras were real, and none of it reached down and shook a single fault. And I think there is something almost reassuring in understanding why. It means the universe is not a place where everything is secretly tangled together, where a flicker on the sun reaches across 93 million miles of empty space to crack the ground beneath your feet. The Earth's earthquakes belong to the Earth. They are ours, generated by our own restless plates, on their own schedule, for their own reasons. That is the honest picture, and honesty here is not the enemy of wonder. The real story, a planet whose entire ocean rim is loaded with magnitude 9 faults, all flexing on their own, is far stranger and more humbling than any sunspot ever could be. There is a way to feel the scale of the energy mismatch that makes it land harder than any statistic, so let me try it. The tides, the daily rise and fall of the oceans, are caused by the gravity of the moon and the sun physically deforming the entire Earth, flexing the whole planet twice a day, every day, for billions of years. That is a far more direct and powerful mechanical influence on the solid Earth than any geomagnetic storm could ever be. The tidal flexing actually does change the stress on faults, by a tiny amount, in a way we can measure. And after decades of looking, scientists have found only the faintest, most marginal hint that the tides nudge the timing of some earthquakes, and even that is a subtle statistical whisper, nowhere near strong enough to predict anything. Now consider this. If the moon physically bending the entire planet twice a day barely moves the needle on earthquakes, what chance does a solar storm, whose mechanical effect on the lower crust is far smaller still, have of triggering a great rupture? The answer is none. The moon outmuscles the sun's magnetic tantrums by an enormous margin when it comes to actually squeezing rock, and even the moon can barely do it. That is the scale we are talking about. I think it also helps to understand what a solar storm genuinely does affect, because the real effects are dramatic enough that you can see why people overreach. A powerful geomagnetic storm can paint the sky with auroras at latitudes that never normally see them. It can disrupt radio communications and satellite navigation. It can induce rogue electrical currents in long power lines and pipelines, and in the most extreme historical cases, it has damaged transformers and knocked out power grids. These are real, serious consequences, and space weather is absolutely worth watching for its own sake. But notice what every single one of those effects has in common. They all happen in the realm of electricity and magnetism, in the atmosphere, in the wires and circuits and charged particles. None of them reaches down into the solid rock to push a fault. The sun's power over us is electromagnetic, and the Earth's earthquakes are mechanical, and those two domains barely touch. The aurora and the earthquake live in different worlds. So when that big sunspot, region 4478, stared down at Earth during this restless week, it was capable of genuinely impressive things, of lighting up skies and rattling satellites. It was not capable of shaking Oregon or swarming the Manila Trench, and the quiet geomagnetic readings during the very window the quakes occurred are the proof, written in the data, that it did not. The sun was busy, the Earth was busy, and they were busy entirely independently, two great engines running side by side, 93 million miles apart, each minding its own enormous business. But the sun is not the only false explanation that surfaces on a night like this. When the ground gets restless and people get frightened, other theories crawl out too, darker ones, about secret machines and hidden numbers and things being kept from us. And those deserve an honest answer just as much as the sun does, because the fear underneath them is real even when the theories are not. Part 12. The Ghosts in the Machine. When the Earth starts acting up and people feel that primal unease, a particular family of ideas tends to surface, and I want to address them directly, because dismissing people with a wave of the hand never helped anyone, and the anxiety underneath these theories is completely understandable. The first one you will hear is the idea that these earthquakes are not natural at all, that they are being deliberately caused by some secret human technology, with the most popular version pointing a finger at a research facility and a set of initials that has become a kind of all-purpose villain in these conversations. The claim is that someone somewhere is engineering earthquakes, and the answer to this is the same answer we just gave to the sun, only more so. It comes back to energy. To engineer a great earthquake, you would need to deliver on demand into a precise spot far down in the crust, the amount of energy that the plates themselves take centuries to accumulate. There is no human technology that comes remotely close to that capability. We cannot store that kind of energy, we cannot deliver it underground, we cannot focus it on a fault. The entire output of every power plant on the planet, run for a long time, does not approach the energy released in a single great earthquake. And beyond the energy problem, there is a simpler tell. The earthquakes of the world do not happen wherever someone might want them. They happen exactly along the plate boundaries, the subduction zones and transform faults, precisely where the geology says they should, and nowhere else. If earthquakes were being manufactured, they would not so perfectly trace the natural seams of the planet. They trace those seams because the planet, not any machine, is making them. The second idea in this family is subtler, and in a way more corrosive. It is the suspicion that the real numbers are being hidden, that the authorities know something is coming and are suppressing the true scale of what is happening, that the official earthquake catalogues are being scrubbed or downplayed to prevent panic. And I understand exactly where this feeling comes from. When you sense that something big is brewing and the official sources sound calm, it is natural to suspect the calm is a cover. But here is why it does not hold together. The monitoring of earthquakes is not controlled by any single authority that could hide anything. It is a global, redundant, fiercely independent network. The United States Geological Survey, the European agencies, regional networks in dozens of countries, university seismologists, and countless independent observers with their own instruments are all watching the same planet at the same time, and their data cross-checks against each other constantly. If one agency tried to hide a great earthquake, 100 others would see it instantly because the seismic waves from a large quake travel through the entire planet and arrive at every seismograph on Earth. You cannot hide a magnitude 9. The physics makes it impossible. So why does it feel like there is more activity than ever, like the planet is more restless than it used to be? That feeling is real, but the cause is not a cover-up. The cause is that we are living in the most densely monitored, most instantly connected moment in human history. There are vastly more seismometers now than there were even a few decades ago, sensitive enough to detect tiny events that would have gone completely unnoticed in the past. And the moment anything happens anywhere, it is on your screen within minutes, alongside every other event from around the whole globe, all at once. We are not seeing more earthquakes because the Earth is breaking down. We are seeing more earthquakes because we have finally built the eyes to see what was always there. The Ring of Fire has been this active for millions of years. We just used to be blind to most of it. There is one more version of the hidden numbers idea that deserves a direct answer, because it is subtler than outright cover-up and it catches thoughtful people. It is the suspicion that even if no one is hiding individual quakes, the official agencies are deliberately downplaying the danger, softening their language, telling everyone to stay calm when privately they are alarmed. And here the honest answer has two halves. The first half is that scientists genuinely are calm in a specific technical sense, not because they think the danger is small, but because they have made their peace with the fact that the danger is real, ancient, and not changed by this week's headlines. A seismologist looking at the Oregon quake is not panicking, and that is not because she is hiding something. It is because she already knew the fault was loaded last year and the year before, and a moderate offshore jolt does not change what she already understood. Her calm is not concealment, it is perspective. The second half is the part that should actually reassure you, and it cuts the opposite way from the conspiracy. If anything, the official hazard assessments are not too soft. They are blunt to a degree that surprises people when they read them directly. The published government and academic reports on Cascadia describe thousands of deaths, the collapse of infrastructure, coastal communities cut off for weeks, fuel and water and power gone for an extended time. These are not documents written to keep people calm. They are some of the most sobering risk assessments ever produced about any natural hazard in North America, and they are sitting in public, available to anyone who cares to read them. The truth about Cascadia is not being hidden behind a wall of false calm. It is published in detail in plain language, and the strange reality is that the official version is often scarier than the rumours, not tamer. The danger was never the secret. The danger is in the open. What is missing is not disclosure. What is missing is attention and the will to act on what we already openly know. And that reframes the whole impulse, doesn't it? The conspiracy says the establishment is keeping a frightening truth from you. The actual situation is almost the reverse. The frightening truth has been laid out plainly for years, and most of us have simply chosen not to look at it because it is uncomfortable, and the day-to-day calm makes it easy to ignore. There is no locked vault of suppressed earthquake data. There is a public library of unheeded warnings, and the most useful thing any of us can do is not to go hunting for hidden secrets, but to read the unhidden ones and then to act. I think it is worth pausing on why these theories are so seductive, because understanding that is more useful than just debunking them. A secret machine, or a government cover-up, or a sunspot pulling the strings, all of these share one comforting feature. They put a mind behind the chaos. They make the terrifying randomness of a restless planet into something intentional, something with a cause you could, in principle, identify and fight. The truly frightening truth is the one with no villain in it at all. The truth is that we live on the thin, cooling skin of a molten world, that the continents float and grind and lock and slip with sublime indifference to us, and that no one is steering it, no one is hiding it, and no one can stop it. That is harder to sit with than any conspiracy. but it is also the only version that lets you do the one thing that actually helps. Because if no one is causing these earthquakes, and no one can predict exactly when the next great one will come, then the only question that is actually within your power to answer is a very different one. It is not when will it happen, or who is behind it. It is, when it comes, and it will come, what will you have done to be ready? And that question, the only useful question in this entire story, is where we turn next. Part 13. The Prophets Who Cannot See. Before we talk about what you can actually do, I have to clear away one more illusion, because it stands directly in the way of getting prepared, and it is the most tempting illusion of all. It is the belief that someone, somewhere, can tell you exactly when the next great earthquake will strike. That if you just follow the right person, watch the right signs, track the right swarm, you will get a warning, a date, a heads up. I wish that were true. It is not, and the gap between how badly we want it to be true and how completely impossible it actually is has become a small industry of false prophets, and you deserve to know why they cannot deliver what they promise. Let me be precise about what science can and cannot do here, because the distinction is everything. Seismologists are very good at forecasting in the long-term statistical sense. They can tell you with real authority that the southern Cascadia segment has roughly a 1 in 3 chance of a major earthquake in the next 50 years. They can tell you the Manila Trench is loaded and capable of a magnitude 9.2. That is forecasting, and it is genuine, useful science, the same way a climate scientist can tell you the odds of a hot summer without naming the temperature on a specific day. But prediction, in the sense people actually crave, naming the day, the hour, the magnitude, the place, in advance, is something no one on Earth can do. Not the United States Geological Survey, not any university, not any individual watching the data. The capability does not exist, and there are sound physical reasons to believe it may never exist. Here is why. The thing that determines when a fault finally fails is the state of the rock at the precise point where the rupture will begin, miles down in the crust, at a level of detail we simply cannot measure. We cannot see down there with that resolution. We do not know the exact stress, the exact friction, the exact tiny flaw that will be the first to give way. And because a great rupture can begin from a tiny initial slip and then cascade, the difference between a swarm that fizzles out and a swarm that becomes a magnitude 9 can come down to conditions far too small and too far down for us to observe in advance. This is why the swarm on the Manila Trench, as alarming as it is, cannot be turned into a prediction. We genuinely do not know whether it will fade, as the overwhelming majority of swarms do, or whether it is the rare one that precedes something larger. Anyone who claims to know which it is, with confidence, is claiming a power that does not exist. And this is where the false prophets do real harm, because they are clever about it. The trick is simple. You watch the planet constantly, you point at every swarm and every moderate quake, and say something big could be coming, and you do it over and over every single day. Most of the time, nothing big follows, and those misses are quietly forgotten. But every so often, by pure chance, a large earthquake does happen somewhere after you have issued one of your endless warnings, and that one hit gets remembered and celebrated and shared as proof of a gift. It is not a gift. It is the mathematics of always saying yes. If you predict catastrophe every day, you will eventually be standing near one when it arrives, and the human mind, which remembers the dramatic hit and forgets the 1,000 quiet misses, will hand you a reputation you did not earn. This is not prophecy. It is survivorship bias dressed up as insight, and it preys on exactly the fear that a night like this one creates. I am not telling you this to make you cynical, or to make you stop paying attention. The opposite, actually. Watching the planet is good. Curiosity is good. Following the data, learning the science, understanding the faults beneath your feet, all of that is genuinely valuable, and it is part of why you are here. But there is a difference between informed attention and the false comfort of believing someone will ring a bell for you the day before. There will be no bell. For Cascadia, the warning you get may be nothing more than the shaking itself. For the Manila Trench, it may be 2 minutes of water already on the move. The great earthquakes of the world do not announce themselves on a schedule, and the sooner we let go of the fantasy that they will, the sooner we can focus on the only thing that has ever actually saved lives. There is a genuine, hard-won success story buried in all of this, and it is worth telling, because it is the closest thing we have to a real warning system, and it is nothing like the fantasy of prediction. It is called earthquake early warning, and it does not predict anything at all. Instead, it exploits a simple fact of physics. When a fault ruptures, it sends out two kinds of waves. The first, the so-called primary wave, travels fast but is relatively gentle. The second, the surface waves that follow, are slower but carry the violent, destructive shaking. Early warning systems place sensors near the fault zones, and the instant they detect that first fast, gentle wave, computers calculate where the rupture began and how big it is likely to be, and they fire off an alert that races ahead of the slow, destructive shaking at the speed of light through the data networks. The warning beats the damage to your phone by seconds, sometimes by tens of seconds. Now, seconds may not sound like much, but seconds are the difference between standing in the open and being under a desk, between a surgeon lifting the scalpel and not, between a train still racing along at full speed and a train already braking, between gas lines still open and gas lines already shut. Systems like this are operating along parts of the West Coast and in Japan, and they have already, demonstrably, given people those precious seconds. But notice what this is and what it is not. It is not prediction. It does not tell you tomorrow that an earthquake is coming. It tells you, in the very instant the rupture has already begun, that the shaking is on its way, and it buys you a few seconds of head start. That is the real, honest, physically possible version of a warning, and it is a genuine triumph of science. It is also a humbling reminder of the limits. The very best warning we can give is measured in seconds, delivered only after the fault has already let go. There is no version where someone hands you a date in advance. So when you encounter someone who claims they can do better than that, who claims they can name the day next week or next month, hold them to the standard of that real system. The actual science, with all its sensors and supercomputers and decades of research, can manage seconds after the fact. The honest scientists who built that miracle will be the first to tell you that the longer-range prediction does not exist. So when an individual with a webcam and a hunch claims a power that the entire global scientific enterprise has concluded is impossible, the most respectful thing you can do, both to them and to yourself, is to ask the simple question. Where is the track record counting every miss as well as every hit? It never survives that question. Because here is the liberating truth hidden inside all of this uncertainty. You do not need to know the date. You never did. The whole point of preparation is that it works precisely because it does not depend on prediction. You do not prepare for the earthquake you can see coming. You prepare for the one you cannot. And that turns out to be something almost everyone can do in ways that are simpler and more human than you might expect. So let me tell you what the people who study these faults for a living actually do in their own homes, and what they quietly wish everyone living on top of these fault lines would do too. Part 14. What you actually do. Here is the part of the story that I think matters most, and it is the part that gets the least attention, because it is not dramatic, and it does not go viral. After everything we have talked about, the locked fault, the 326 years, the magnitude 9, the 2-minute tsunami, the honest answer to the question, what do I do with this, is not panic, and it is not despair, and it is certainly not refreshing a feed all night waiting for the next number to appear. It is something much quieter and much more powerful. It is preparation, and the remarkable thing about preparation is that it is the one response to all of this that is completely within your control. Start with the simplest thing, the thing the scientists themselves do. If you live in earthquake country, and a surprising amount of the world does, you secure your space. The most common injuries in an earthquake do not come from the ground opening up, which is mostly a Hollywood invention. They come from things falling on people, heavy furniture that tips over, bookcases, water heaters, mirrors, objects on high shelves becoming projectiles during minutes of shaking. Strapping a bookshelf to a wall stud, securing a water heater, moving heavy objects off high shelves, these are afternoon projects, not life overhauls, and they are the difference between walking out of a shaking building and being trapped under what was in it. The people who know the most about these faults are, almost without exception, the people whose own homes are the most boringly methodically secured. Then there is the knowledge of what to do in the moment itself, and it is simple enough to teach a child, which is exactly why we drill it. When the ground starts shaking, you drop. You take cover under something sturdy and you hold on. Drop cover, hold on. You do not run outside where falling debris from the building's exterior is one of the most dangerous places to be. You get low, you get under a solid table or desk, you protect your head and neck and you wait it out. And if you are on the coast within reach of a tsunami, The rule layered on top of that is just as simple and just as vital. The shaking is your warning. The moment the ground stops, if you are near the shore, you move to high ground immediately on foot, without waiting for any official alert, because as we saw, for the nearest coasts there may be no time for an alert at all. Knowing your evacuation route before you ever need it, the way coastal communities in the Pacific Northwest and Japan have started teaching their children, is the kind of knowledge that costs nothing and saves everything. And then there is the basic readiness that carries you through the days after, when the cascade we talked about unfolds, when the power is out and the roads are broken and the supplies cannot get in. A store of water, enough for several days because water systems fail and may take a long time to come back. Food that does not need refrigeration or cooking. A way to get information when the grid is down. Medications, a first aid kit, sturdy shoes by the bed so you can walk over broken glass. None of this is exotic. It is the same humble readiness your grandparents might have taken for granted, and in a region that could be cut off from the outside for days or longer after a great rupture, it is the difference between weathering the aftermath and becoming a casualty of it. A simple, often repeated guideline is to be able to take care of yourself and your household for at least 2 weeks without outside help, because in a regional disaster of this scale, that is realistically how long it could take for organised aid to reach some areas. 2 weeks of water, of food, of medication, of the basics. It sounds like a lot until you break it into a few trips to the store spread over a few months, at which point it becomes almost trivial, a closet shelf slowly filled, a habit rather than a project. The people who do it do not live in fear. They simply have one fewer thing to worry about, and that quiet confidence is its own reward, earthquake or no earthquake. But I want to tell you about the single most important preparation of all, because it is the one that surprises people, and it is the one that disaster researchers will tell you matters more than any stockpile. It is your neighbours. When a great earthquake strikes and the professional first responders are overwhelmed, cut off, and stretched impossibly thin across an entire region, the people who actually pull survivors out of the rubble, who check on the elderly person down the street, who share water and tools and shelter in the first critical hours and days, are not distant agencies. They are the people who live within a few hundred feet of you. Study after study of real disasters finds the same thing. The communities that suffer the least are not necessarily the ones with the most supplies. They are the ones where people knew each other beforehand, where there was a web of human connection already in place when everything else failed. Knowing your neighbours, the names of the people on your street, who might need help and who can give it, is not sentimental advice. It is, measurably, survival infrastructure. I want to address something that I think holds a lot of people back from doing any of this, because it is a real psychological barrier and pretending it does not exist helps no one. When a threat is this large and this uncertain, the natural response is not action. It is a kind of paralysis. The mind looks at a magnitude 9, at a region coming apart, at a date no one can name, and it concludes that nothing it could possibly do would matter against something that big, so why bother? It is easier to file the whole thing under some day, to decide it is too enormous and too far off to act on, and to go back to the ordinary business of life. I understand that completely. But it is exactly backward, and the people who study disasters will tell you so. The size of the threat is not a reason to do nothing. The things we talked about, securing your home, learning the drill, storing water, knowing your neighbours, are not trivial gestures against an unstoppable force. They are measurably the difference between who lives and who does not in the real disasters that have already happened. The earthquake is enormous and indifferent. Your preparation is small and specific, and the small specific thing is the one that works. There is also a further down reframe here that I think is worth offering, because it changes how the whole subject feels to carry around. Living near one of these faults is not a curse, and it is not a reason for constant dread. People have always lived in places that carry risk, by rivers that flood, on plains that storm, beneath mountains that burn. The Pacific Northwest is one of the most beautiful regions on Earth, and the same plate tectonics that make it dangerous are the very forces that built its mountains and carved its coast, and made it the place people love. The goal is not to live in fear of the ground. The goal is to live in clear-eyed relationship with it, to accept the real terms of the place you have chosen, to do the handful of sane things those terms ask of you, and then to get on with the full, good business of your life. Fear is not the appropriate response to a 1 in 3 chance over 50 years. Respect is, preparation is, and then peace. And the pro-social truth at the center of all of it deserves to be said as plainly as possible. The single most powerful thing you can do is to not be alone in this. A prepared household is good. A prepared street, a prepared neighborhood, a community where people know each other's names and needs before the disaster comes is worth more than any individual stockpile. Because the help that actually arrives in the first hours after a great earthquake comes from the people standing closest to you. So if you take one thing from 2 hours of talking about loaded faults and silent strain, let it be the least technical and most human thing of all. Go meet your neighbors. It is, against all intuition, an earthquake preparedness measure, and it happens to also be one of the better ways to be a person. So that is the answer. That is what you do with the fear that a night like this one stirs up. You do not let it curdle into helplessness, and you do not let it get spent on the false prophets and the conspiracy theories that promise control they cannot deliver. You turn it into the few simple, quiet, profoundly effective things that are actually in your hands. You secure your home. You learn the drill. You build a little readiness. You know your neighbors, and then you go on living your life fully without dread, because you have done the one thing that genuinely answers the danger. The fault will keep its own schedule. You cannot change that. But you can decide who you will be and how ready you will be on the day it finally chooses. And that, in the end, brings us back to where we started and to the question that has been waiting underneath this entire story. Part 15. The Last Quiet Week. Let us go back to the beginning, to that magnitude 5.5 off the coast of Bandon in the dark early hours of a Monday morning. By itself, we said, it was nothing. 1,000 of them happen every year, and that is still true. But I hope that now, after everything we have walked through together, you can feel why it was not nothing, why a handful of seismologists held still for a moment when they saw where it had struck. It was a flicker of motion from a system that has been holding its breath for 326 years. It was the loaded plate twitching, off the coast of a fault built to end the Pacific Northwest, during a week when the slow tremor beneath that same fault was running hot, on the segment most likely to go first. It did not change the odds. It just made the odds, for a moment, impossible to ignore. And here is the thought I cannot stop turning over, the one I want to leave you with. We know, with certainty, that the great Cascadia earthquake is coming. The trees told us. The Japanese records told us. The mud on the ocean floor, 10,000 years of it, told us. It has happened before and it will happen again, and the same is true of the Manila Trench and the Alaskan margin and a dozen other loaded faults around the restless rim of the Pacific. That part is not in doubt. The only thing we do not know, the only thing we cannot know, is when. And that uncertainty hides a strange and unsettling implication that I think most people never quite let themselves see. It is this. If the warning we get is the kind of warning we got this week, a moderate jolt 200 miles offshore, a faint tremor no instrument-free human could ever feel, a swarm of small shocks on the far side of an ocean, then how would any of us ever know the difference between an ordinary quiet week and the last quiet week before everything changes? The great earthquake will not send a messenger. There will be no headline the day before. The 1700 rupture was preceded by a Sunday that looked exactly like the Sunday before it, and the people living on that coast went to sleep on the 25th of January with no idea that the 26th would rewrite their world. Every quiet week looks identical to every other quiet week, right up until the one that is not. That is not a thought meant to frighten you, although I understand if it does. It is meant to do something more useful than that. It is meant to dissolve the illusion that we are waiting for a signal, that there will be a clear before and after with a warning in between. There will not be. There is only now, this quiet week, and the choices available in it. And once you truly absorb that there will be no bell, no countdown, no prophet pointing at the calendar, something shifts. The preparation we talked about stops being a someday project and becomes a today one, not out of fear, but out of a kind of clear-eyed acceptance of the world as it actually is. The strain is accumulating right now, tonight, in the locked seam off the coast, in perfect silence, the way it has every night for 3 centuries. None of us can hear it, but now at least you know it is there. The quake off Bandon will be forgotten by most people within a day or two, filed away as a minor tremor on a quiet coast. But the fault it sat beside will still be there, still locked, still loading, still keeping its own ancient time, and somewhere out under that cold water, the count goes on. 326 years, 327. The Pacific Northwest will wake up tomorrow to another ordinary morning, and the morning after that, and the one after that, each of them indistinguishable from the last. Until, one day, on a date no one can name, on a coast that looks exactly the way it looks tonight, the silence finally ends, and the only thing that will matter, in that moment, is what we chose to do during all the quiet weeks we were given first.